Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive, completely uncounted factor in the fight against global warming, one that is literally destroying our collective home. You know, as geopolitical tensions escalate all over the globe and military budgets at absolute record highs, there's this hidden climate toll of warfare that gets almost zero attention. When bombs fall, our immediate focus is obviously on the horrific loss of human life and the shattered communities, but right there, buried beneath the rubble, lies another major casualty: the climate itself.
So let's dive right into this staggering number. The world's militaries, along with their massive supply chains, account for roughly 5.5% of all annual global greenhouse gas emissions. Just let that sink in for a second. We're living through the hottest years on record, pouring trillions of dollars into green energy transitions, and at the exact same time, armed conflicts are just pumping hundreds of millions of tons of greenhouse gases straight into the atmosphere. Which brings us to a really monumental question. How on earth can we possibly achieve our global green goals when the true scale of warfare's environmental impact is completely invisible in global climate accounting? It's the ultimate blind spot. This accounting gap is getting wider every single year. It diverts essential funding away from green initiatives while actively destroying critical carbon sinks. It's a massive paradox, and honestly, we just can't ignore it anymore.
Here's how we're going to break this down today. 1. The climate action blind spot. 2. Defining the term ecocide. 3. The peacetime military footprint. 4. Ecological toll of active wars. And finally, 5. International law and accountability.
Starting off with Section 1, the climate action blind spot.
Despite having this enormous environmental footprint we just talked about, military emissions are effectively exempt from mandatory reporting under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Think about that. A November 2025 analysis by Scientists for Global Responsibility found that official UN data captures, on average, less than 10% of the true carbon footprint of a military campaign. So while we're demanding strict climate action from basically every other sector of the economy, this isn't just a missing data point, it's a fundamental roadblock to actually reaching our global climate goals.
Moving on to Section 2, defining the term ecocide.
To really grasp the severity of this issue, we need to understand the language experts are using here. Warfare isn't just a human conflict. If we look at the etymology, the word ecocide combines oikos, meaning house or home, and katere, meaning destroying. It literally translates to homicide. It's the destruction of our shared collective home, the Earth. Some scientists break it down simply as the killing of the natural environment as a direct result of human activity. And the way this concept has evolved is actually fascinating. The term was first coined back in 1970 by Arthur Galston to describe the sheer devastation caused by the U.S. military's use of poisonous gas during the Vietnam War. Fast forward to today, and an independent expert panel has formalized the definition. They describe it as unlawful or wanton acts committed with the knowledge that there's a substantial likelihood of severe, widespread, or long-term damage to the environment. All right, Section 3. The peacetime military footprint. Now, before a single weapon is even fired, the military-industrial complex has a mind-blowing baseline impact. If the world's armed forces were a single country, they would rank as the fourth largest carbon emitter on the entire planet, completely surpassing the nation of Russia. Getting ready for war requires massive resource extraction, mining, drilling for fossil fuels, harvesting timber, all just to produce weapons and infrastructure. The U.S. Department of Defense alone is actually the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world. They contribute more greenhouse gases than over 150 countries combined.
To put those huge abstract numbers into a perspective we can actually relate to, let's look at a single Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II fighter jet. This jet burns through roughly 5,600 to 6,500 liters of fuel during just a short 1.5 to 2 hour combat mission. That one brief flight pumps about 14 to 17 tons of carbon dioxide into the air. To give you an idea, that is the exact same amount of emissions a standard passenger car will produce over its entire lifetime. Literally, one 2-hour flight equals a whole lifetime of driving. Crazy, right?
Which leads us to Section 4, ecological toll of active wars.
So, if peacetime prep is that destructive, what happens when conflicts actually break out? Well, the impacts on ecosystems are immediate, they are cumulative, and they are transnational. Live fire exercises, bombing ranges, and missile strikes turn entire landscapes into total wastelands. The soil gets contaminated with toxic residues, and wildlife habitats are just wiped out. And the damage doesn't respect borders. Atmospheric pollution from these strikes travels, affecting ecosystems geographically far away from the actual battlefield.
Looking neutrally at the data from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we see a tragic case study in modern environmental devastation. Since February 2022, the conflict has generated over 294 million tons of CO2 equivalent. That single figure exceeds the annual emissions of 175 countries. The sheer destruction of buildings alone accounts for 43 million tons. Fires triggered by bombings have burned through forests, releasing another 22 million tons. And devastatingly, over 30% of Ukraine's environmentally protected areas, including UNESCO biosphere reserves, have been impacted.
We see incredibly similar devastation in the data from the first 15 months of military operations in Gaza. The total climate cost there exceeded 31 million tons of CO2 equivalent. Satellite data shows that 80% of Gaza's trees have been totally eradicated. There's an estimated 61 million tons of hazardous rubble left behind. And pay attention to this energy shift. Before the war, solar energy covered 25% of Gaza's electricity, but the destruction of that green infrastructure forced a highly polluting pivot back to diesel generators, which produces an estimated 58,000 extra tons of CO2 every single year.
And these devastating dynamics are visible in recent geopolitical escalations in other regions too. Preliminary modeling from the attacks on Iran's oil storage facilities reveals immense environmental costs. In just the first 14 days of that conflict, more than 5 million tons of CO2 were released into the atmosphere. To visualize that, it's the equivalent of taking the annual emissions from 1.1 million gas-powered cars and just dumping it into our atmosphere in 2 weeks of targeted destruction.
Section 5, International Law and Accountability. So with all this data out in the open, why aren't international laws stopping this? Well, the source material highlights that traditional just war theory relies on a clear distinction between combatants and non-combatants. But in modern conflict, civilian infrastructure and the environment have actually become the terrain of war. This ecological harm isn't just incidental collateral damage anymore. It's a central feature. And this is happening despite a historic advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice last July, which legally bound states to protect the climate system. Modern military operations are effectively just bypassing these legal frameworks entirely.
This brings us to the core argument of our source text. The author, who is an expert in international law, claims that current political leaders are driving a fundamentally flawed geopolitical system. To quote the text directly, the Netanyahus, Putins, and Trumps of the world are not only waging illegal wars and trashing humanitarian covenants, they are committing ecocide on a horrendous scale. Now, reporting strictly from the source here, the author uses this to argue that our current fossil fuel geopolitics are totally incompatible with maintaining a livable planet.
So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Wars will obviously continue to degrade ecosystems and burn through massive amounts of fuel. But as long as this colossal devastation is kept completely off the books and exempt from UN reporting, are our global climate pledges just an illusion? If we're genuinely serious about healing our planetary home, we absolutely have to pull this blind spot into the light and factor the true environmental cost of conflict into global policy. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning what you see and what you don't see on the balance sheets.